Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When they opened the letter in their five-star hotel in Paris, I can only imagine the panic that spread across their faces. Their perfect vacation, months of planning, bragging, and gloating, was about to crash and burn. I wasn't there to see it, of course, but the way I'd crafted every word, I knew it would hit them like a truck. And the best part? They had no idea it was coming. But let me back up. To really understand what happened that day, you need to know how I got to that point. Growing up, I never imagined my life would turn into someone else's free babysitting gig. My dad passed away when I was 14, and within a year, my stepmother, Claire, had moved in. She didn't waste any time showing me how things were going to work. At first, I tried to believe that maybe she was just strict. She said she was helping me build character by giving me chores. She insisted I was part of the family when she made me watch her two kids every weekend while she and her husband went out. But it didn't take long for me to realize I wasn't a daughter in this house. I was the unpaid help. By the time I graduated high school, I was ready to leave. I had a scholarship lined up, a chance to finally live my own life. But Claire had other plans. "You're not going to college," she said flatly one night at the dinner table. Her husband, Mike, nodded along like the obedient sidekick he was. "We need you here to help with the kids. You're lucky we've taken care of you all these years. The least you can do is give back." Her tone made it clear this wasn't a discussion. She wasn't just asking me to stay. She was demanding it. When I tried to push back, she hit me with the guilt trip of a lifetime. "Do you know how much we've spent on you? On clothes, food, keeping a roof over your head? If it weren't for me, you'd have been out on the street after your father died. You owe me, Jenny." It stung, mostly because part of me believed her. At least, I did back then. I was 18, trapped in a house where every time I spoke up, I was reminded that I was lucky to have a place at all. She made sure I knew exactly how worthless I'd be without her. So I stayed. I deferred my dreams of college, thinking maybe I'd save up and go later. But later never came. Claire found ways to keep me tethered. Unexpected emergencies, endless guilt trips, and constant reminders that I was needed. Anytime I brought up leaving, she'd snap, "Don't be selfish, Jenny. You're part of this family. Start acting like it." I became a live-in nanny, a cook, and a cleaner, all under the guise of being a good daughter. I was invisible to them except when they needed something. The kids were too young to know better. To them, I was just another adult in the house. But Claire and Mike knew exactly what they were doing. For years, I let it slide. I told myself things would get better. But the truth is, they only got worse. Then one day something changed. Claire came home from a shopping trip and tossed a new pair of designer shoes on the table. She looked at me, smirking. "Oh, by the way, your college fund? We had to dip into it. Emergency expenses. You understand." I didn't say a word. I just nodded and walked back to my room. But inside, something snapped. She wasn't just holding me back. She was erasing my future. That night, as the house settled into its usual silence, I started working on my escape plan. It wasn't just about leaving. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they'd done to me. Every time I washed their dishes or folded their laundry, I imagined the day I'd finally be free. And so, I waited, patiently, quietly, until the perfect moment presented itself. When Claire announced their big European vacation, I knew this was it. "Paris. Can you believe it?" she said, beaming as she waved the itinerary in my face. "You'll take care of the house while we're gone. And the kids, of course." I smiled and nodded. "Of course, Claire. You can count on me." She didn't know that I'd already been saving every penny I could scrape together. She didn't know that I'd secretly opened a P.O. box, filed a change of address, and started packing my things into storage. And she definitely didn't know that I had one last surprise waiting for them. The day they left, I helped load their luggage into the car, waved goodbye, and watched as they disappeared down the street. By the time their flight took off, I was already long gone. But not before leaving them a little gift, a letter carefully placed among their travel documents. It wasn't just a goodbye note. It was a reckoning. When Claire and Mike opened that letter, I can only imagine their confusion at first. Maybe they thought it was just a thank you note for raising me. But once they read the first few lines, that confusion would have turned to shock. That letter was the culmination of years of quiet frustration, calculated down to the last detail. But before I tell you what it said, let me take you back to how it all began. After my dad passed away, I clung to the hope that Claire would at least try to be a decent stepmother. For the first few months, she played the part. She'd cook dinners, ask how school was going, and even tell me that my dad would have been so proud of me. It felt like maybe, just maybe, she cared. But as time passed, her mask started to slip. Little things at first, a sarcastic comment about my clothes, her constant reminders that she was doing the best she could raising me. By the time I turned 16, she stopped pretending altogether. You know, Jenny, she said one night as I did the dishes, not everyone would have taken on the burden of raising someone else's kid. I froze, my hands submerged in soapy water. Burden? I wanted to scream, but I just nodded and kept scrubbing. Things got worse when Mike entered the picture. Claire met him at some charity event, and within a year, they were married. He wasn't cruel like Claire, at least not directly. But he went along with everything she said, treating me more like a tenant than a stepdaughter. When their kids came along, 2 little boys named Tyler and Ethan, I became their unofficial nanny. Claire would say things like, "You're so good with them, Jenny. It's natural for you." But good with them turned into full-time responsibility. Feeding them, bathing them, watching them every weekend while Claire and Mike went on date nights. Family helps family, she'd say, handing me the baby monitor before heading out the door. At first, I told myself this was temporary. I'd graduate high school, go to college, and finally have my own life. But then came the crushing blow, Claire informing me that my college plans were canceled. "You're staying here," she said, as if it were a fact written in stone. I tried to argue. "Claire, I work for that scholarship. I want to be a teacher. You can't just..." She cut me off, laughing. "Oh, honey, life isn't about what you want. We're family. We stick together. Besides, who's going to help with the boys? Do you expect me to do it all on my own?" I wanted to yell, to remind her that these were her kids, not mine. But every time I pushed back, she'd guilt-trip me harder. "You're selfish, Jenny. After all I've done for you, this is how you repay me? You think I owe you a free ride to college? I've sacrificed everything to keep this family together." So I stayed. I stayed while my friends went off to dorm rooms and freedom, while I stayed behind changing diapers and making grilled cheese sandwiches. Claire kept me on a short leash, too. She controlled everything, my money, my schedule, even what I ate. If I asked for a day off, she'd sigh dramatically and remind me how exhausting her life was. One moment sticks out like a scar. It was a Saturday night, and I'd been watching the boys all day while Claire and Mike were out shopping. I was exhausted, and Tyler was throwing one of his legendary tantrums. When they finally came home, I told Claire I needed a break. She looked at me like I'd just told her to sell her soul. "A break? From what? You don't even have a real job, Jenny. This is your job." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how my life had spiraled into this. I had dreams once. I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to make my dad proud. But Claire had turned me into a shadow of myself. The final straw came a few months later. I'd managed to save a tiny bit of money from odd jobs I picked up on the side. Claire found the stash one day while cleaning my room. "What's this?" she demanded, holding up the cash. I tried to stay calm. "It's mine. I've been saving for her." "For what?" she snapped. "You don't have anything to spend it on. Honestly, Jenny, it's insulting that you're hiding money from us. We're a family. You're supposed to contribute." And just like that, she took it. Every cent. That night, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to spend another year, another month, another day living like this. I didn't care how much guilt Claire tried to pile on me. She could call me selfish all she wanted. I was done being her servant. The first step was small. I started packing little things, clothes, books, personal items, and moving them to a storage unit a few blocks away. Next, I got a second job under the table, one she didn't know about. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start building a real escape fund. I kept my head down, played along, and waited for the right moment. And then, like fate, Claire announced their trip to Europe. 10 days in Paris, she said, practically glowing. "And don't worry, Jenny, we'll leave you a list of things to do while we're gone." I smiled, nodded, and said, "Of course, Claire." But in my head, I was already gone. The night after Claire announced their big European vacation, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The kids were asleep, the house was quiet, and all I could hear was the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. My thoughts raced as I pictured their trip, fine dining, sightseeing, and posting smug photos in front of the Eiffel Tower while I scrubbed dishes and wiped sticky handprints off the walls. That was the moment I realized I couldn't stay another day in this house. It wasn't just about the college dreams Claire had crushed or the years of manipulation. It was the principle. Claire had taken everything from me, my time, my independence, my future, and acted like she was doing me a favor. The next day, I reached out to the one person I trusted, my high school friend Katie. She was the kind of friend who'd always been there for me, even when I started to drift away under Claire's control. I called her on my lunch break while the kids were napping. Katie, I can't do this anymore, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. Jenny? She sounded alarmed. What's going on? I hesitated, but then it all poured out. The forced babysitting, the stolen money, the endless guilt trips. By the time I finished, my throat was tight and my hands were shaking. Jenny, Katie said firmly, you have to get out of there. I'm serious. You don't owe her anything. You're not a servant. You're a human being. Her words felt like a lifeline. For the first time in years, someone was telling me what I'd been too scared to admit to myself. I don't even know where to start, I said, wiping tears from my face. Katie didn't miss a beat. Start small. Pack what you need. Save what you can. And when the timing's right, leave. Don't even tell them. Just go. Over the next few weeks, I followed her advice to the letter. I became an expert at moving under Claire's radar, smiling and nodding my way through every interaction while quietly setting my plan into motion. The first thing I did was get a second phone. It was a cheap prepaid one, but it gave me a sense of control Claire couldn't take away. Then I started gathering all my important documents, my birth certificate, my social security card, anything I'd need to rebuild my life. The hardest part was the money. Claire kept me on a tight leash financially, but I found ways to earn cash on the side. I babysat for a neighbor during the few free hours I had each week, and I sold a few old things online. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me a head start. Meanwhile, Claire and Mike were too busy planning their trip to notice. Every evening, they'd sit in the living room with their laptops, debating which luxury hotel to book or which Michelin-starred restaurant to try. Jenny, can you get us some coffee? Claire would call out, not even looking up from her screen. Of course, I'd say, biting back the urge to tell her to get it herself. I kept my head down, played the part, and waited. Finally, the day of their departure arrived. The house was a whirlwind of last-minute packing and barking orders. Claire handed me a list of chores and a lengthy set of instructions for taking care of the kids. Make sure the house is spotless when we get back, she said. And don't forget to water the plants. Got it, I said, keeping my tone light. As they loaded their suitcases into the car, I stood on the porch, smiling and waving. Claire turned to me one last time. Don't screw this up, Jenny, she said, her voice sharp despite the cheery facade. I won't, I replied. And for once, I meant it. As soon as their car disappeared down the street, I sprang into action. I grabbed the backpack I'd hidden in the back of my closet, already packed with clothes, cash, and essentials, and walked out the front door without looking back. My first stop was the storage unit where I'd stashed the rest of my belongings. I loaded everything into a rental car Katie had helped me secure, then drove to the small apartment she'd arranged for me to stay in temporarily. By the time their flight landed in Paris, I was long gone, but I hadn't left without a parting gift. Before leaving, I placed an envelope in the middle of their dining room table, right where they'd see it. Inside was a letter, not just any letter, but one that laid everything bare. I wrote about the years of manipulation, the money they'd stolen, and the countless sacrifices they demanded from me. But that wasn't all. I also included photocopies of receipts and bank statements that proved Claire had drained my college fund to finance her shopping sprees and luxury vacations. And at the bottom of the letter, I wrote one final message. Enjoy your trip. You'll need the memories when this is all over. By the time Claire and Mike touched down in Paris, I was already 2 states away, sitting in a tiny but cozy studio apartment. It wasn't much, just a mattress on the floor, a thrifted lamp, and the faint smell of fresh paint. But it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. But this isn't about me. It's about them and what happened when they realized I was gone. I can picture the scene vividly. Claire and Mike stepping into their luxurious hotel suite, sipping champagne, marveling at the view of the Eiffel Tower. Maybe the kids were bouncing on the bed, too young to care about anything beyond the present moment. Then, at some point, Claire would have decided to unpack her documents and travel itinerary. That's when she would have seen the envelope tucked between the papers. At first, I bet she thought it was a sweet note, a thank you letter, or maybe a list of things I'd done for the house while they were away. I imagine her opening it with a smug grin, probably saying something like, Jenny left us a little note. How thoughtful. But as she started to read, that grin would have melted into confusion, then disbelief, and finally rage. Meanwhile, I was sipping instant coffee in my new apartment, checking the clock and imagining the chaos unraveling half a world away. The thought of them reading my letter filled me with equal parts relief and nervous anticipation. Let me walk you through what I wrote. The letter started innocently enough. Dear Claire and Mike, I hope you're enjoying the start of your trip. By now, you've probably noticed that I'm not at home. From there, I didn't hold back. I laid it all out. how they'd used me, guilt me, and stolen my future. I described how they turned me into their live-in nanny, how they took my college fund without a second thought, and how they dismissed my dreams as if they were nothing. Then I got to the part that would have hit them the hardest. I included photocopies of bank statements showing exactly how much of my college fund they'd spent. I highlighted purchases that weren't just necessities but outright indulgences, designer handbags, spa days, and even part of the down payment for their fancy SUV. At the bottom of the page, I added, "You said I owed you for raising me. Consider us even. Oh, and one more thing. This isn't over." Claire must have lost her mind when she read that last line. She hated not being in control, and the idea that I'd slipped away without her noticing would have driven her insane. Mike, I imagine, would have been quieter, probably staring at the paper in stunned silence while Claire paced the room, ranting about my ingratitude. "You think she's serious?" Mike might have asked, his voice tinged with nervousness. "Oh, she's just being dramatic," Claire would have snapped, though even she wouldn't have sounded entirely convinced. I let them sit with the letter for a while, stewing in their confusion and anger. But I knew that wasn't enough. I didn't just want to disappear. I wanted them to feel the weight of their actions. The real kicker? I'd taken steps to make sure the evidence I left behind didn't stay between us. Before I left, I mailed a similar letter to a family friend, someone who'd always been suspicious of Claire's behavior. That way, I knew the truth would spread, whether Claire liked it or not. Back in Paris, I imagined the vacation started to crumble almost immediately. Claire would have been too angry to enjoy the city, constantly checking her phone and firing off frantic emails to try to track me down. "Do you think she's gone to the police?" Mike might have asked one night as they sat in their hotel room, their nerves fraying. "She wouldn't dare," Claire would have hissed. But deep down, she knew I could, and that thought must have terrified her. As for the kids, I doubt they even noticed I was gone. They were too young to understand the dynamics at play. But that, in a way, made it even worse. Claire didn't just exploit me. She raised her children to think that kind of behavior was normal. That's why I left the letter, not just to confront Claire and Mike, but to shatter the facade they'd built around themselves. They wanted to believe they were the perfect family, and I wanted them to know that the cracks were visible to everyone. Sitting in my apartment that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. For the first time, I wasn't cleaning up someone else's mess or sacrificing my dreams to keep the peace. I was free, and while they were half a world away, unraveling in a hotel room, I was already planning my next steps, because I knew that letter was just the beginning. I don't know exactly how things unfolded in their Parisian hotel room, but I have a pretty good idea. Claire was always predictable when things didn't go her way, loud, dramatic, and completely incapable of self-reflection. So I imagine the discovery of my letter turned their luxurious vacation into a disaster within minutes. Let's set the scene. Claire's sitting on the edge of the bed, clutching the letter, her face flushed with anger. Mike pacing the room, trying to stay calm, but failing. The kids, oblivious to the chaos, probably tugging at Claire's sleeve, asking when they get to see the Eiffel Tower. "What the hell does she mean? This isn't over," Claire would have said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Maybe she's bluffing," Mike would have replied, though the unease in his tone would have been impossible to miss. "She's not bluffing," Claire would have snapped. "She wouldn't dare do this if she didn't have something planned. And she'd be right." Before I left, I made sure to leave a trail. Not for them, but for the people they'd always try to keep in the dark. Claire and Mike had spent years building this image of a perfect family. To outsiders, they were the hard-working couple who doted on their kids and took in a stepdaughter out of the kindness of their hearts. But I knew the truth, and now, so would everyone else. The photocopies I included in the letter weren't just for dramatic effect. They were proof, irrefutable evidence that Claire and Mike had been stealing from me for years. College fund withdrawals labeled as emergencies, luxury purchases disguised as household expenses, and even a few transactions that were straight-up lies. And I didn't stop there. I'd mailed a copy of the same letter to my dad's old lawyer, the one who'd helped set up my college fund in the first place. I knew he'd be interested in seeing how his carefully managed trust had been drained for spa days and weekend getaways. Back in their hotel room, the panic would have started to set in. What if she goes to the police? Mike might have asked, running a hand through his thinning hair. She wouldn't, Claire would have said, though the tightness in her voice would have betrayed her. But what if she already did? That question would have hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. Claire hated not being in control, and the idea that I was out there somewhere, free, unpredictable, and armed with evidence, would have driven her to the edge. I can picture her frantically searching for a way to spin the situation, her mind racing through possible excuses. She's ungrateful, Claire would have muttered, more to herself than to Mike. After everything we've done for her, this is how she repays us? I raised her when no one else would. She owes me. That was her favorite line, her go-to defense whenever she felt cornered. But this time, it wouldn't work, because for the first time, I wasn't there to absorb her guilt trips. I wasn't there to play the role of the dutiful daughter she could manipulate into submission. As they stewed in their panic, I imagined them replaying every interaction we'd had over the past few months, searching for clues they'd missed. When did she even have time to plan this? Mike might have asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. She's been lying to us for who knows how long, Claire would have replied, her anger shifting from me to herself. For someone who thrived on control, the realization that she'd been outsmarted by the very person she'd spent years belittling would have been unbearable. And what about the kids? I doubt they understood what was going on, but I wonder if they sensed the shift in the air, the tension, the raised voices, the way their parents' attention suddenly turned inward. Mommy, when are we going to the Eiffel Tower? Tyler might have asked, tugging on Claire's sleeve. Not now, Tyler, she would have snapped, too distracted to notice the hurt look on his face. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Meanwhile, I was settling into my new life. The apartment Katie had helped me find wasn't much, but it was mine. I spent my first night there unpacking, savoring the quiet, and reflecting on how far I'd come. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my own destiny. I wasn't living under Claire's thumb anymore, constantly waiting for the next guilt trip or demand. I was free to think, to breathe, to plan. And yet, part of me wondered how Claire and Mike would try to recover. Would they double down, insisting I was the problem? Or would they finally be forced to confront the truth? In Paris, I imagine their vacation quickly turned into damage control. Claire might have spent hours on the phone calling lawyers, trying to figure out how much trouble they were in. Mike would have been quieter, more resigned, probably thinking about how this would affect their finances. And through it all, I hope they felt just a fraction of what I'd felt over the years, trapped, powerless, and uncertain about the future. As I sat in my tiny apartment, sipping instant coffee and staring out the window, I couldn't help but smile. For the first time, the roles were reversed. They were the ones cleaning up a mess they couldn't control. And me? I was just getting started. The letter Claire and Mike opened in their Parisian hotel room wasn't just an explanation. It was an indictment. Every word, every page, was designed to make them confront what they had done, even if they'd never admit it out loud. By now, I'm sure they'd read it a dozen times, trying to figure out how I managed to slip away unnoticed. But no amount of rereading would have prepared them for the bombshells I dropped in that letter. The first section was a polite but cutting recap of my life in their house. You took me in after Dad died. For that, I'll always be grateful. But let's not pretend that what you did was charity. From the moment I moved in, I was a tool for your convenience, your free babysitter, your personal maid, your punching bag for guilt and manipulation. I imagined Claire's jaw tightening as she read that. She hated being called out, especially when it came to the way she treated me. The letter went on. You told me I owed you for raising me, but let's talk about what you actually gave me. You stole my college fund to pay for your shopping sprees. You took away my independence and crushed my dreams under the weight of your selfishness. And for what? To keep me stuck in a life I never chose. At this point, Claire's anger would have turned to panic. Because the next part was where I got specific. I attached photocopies of receipts and bank statements that told the whole story. Withdrawals labeled as Jenny's college fund that mysteriously matched the cost of her luxury handbags. Monthly payments for spa memberships, family vacations, and even the down payment on their SUV, all taken directly from the money my dad had set aside for me. And then there was the timeline I laid out, showing how Claire had systematically dismantled every chance I had at building a future. I wanted to go to college, I wrote. You told me it was selfish. I wanted to get a job to save for my own life. You said it was a betrayal of this family. Every time I try to take a step forward, you pull me back. But not anymore. The letter didn't stop there. I wanted them to feel the weight of their actions in every possible way, so I didn't hold back. I've already sent copies of these documents to Dad's lawyer. Remember him? The one who set up my college fund in the first place? He's very interested in seeing how the money was spent. And since this trust was legally protected, I'm pretty sure he'll be following up with you soon. That line would have sent Claire into a tailspin. She'd always relied on her ability to control the narrative, to keep everything contained within the walls of her carefully curated life. But now, the truth was out, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The final part of the letter was the hardest to write, but it was also the most important. You told me I was part of this family, that I needed to sacrifice for the greater good. But what you really meant was that I needed to sacrifice for you. Well, I've made my sacrifices. Now it's your turn. And then at the very bottom of the page, I wrote one last line. Enjoy Paris. You'll need the memories when you get home. I imagine Claire reading that final sentence over and over, trying to figure out what it meant. Was it a threat? A promise? Or just a reminder that no matter how far they ran, they couldn't escape the consequences waiting for them back home? For someone like Claire, who thrived on control, the ambiguity would have been maddening. Meanwhile, Mike would have been pacing the room, probably muttering something about damage control and keeping this quiet. He was always the practical one, the guy who cleaned up Claire's messes while pretending not to notice the cracks in their facade. But this time, there was no cleaning up to be done. Claire would have tried, of course. Maybe she called the lawyer, hoping to smooth things over. Maybe she reached out to family friends, spinning a story about how I was ungrateful or rebelling after everything they'd done for me. But it wouldn't matter, because the evidence spoke for itself. And for the first time in her life, Claire couldn't manipulate her way out of the truth. Back in my new apartment, I imagined all of this unfolding as I unpacked the last of my things. There was a small stack of books on the counter, the kind I used to dream about studying in college. For the first time in years, I felt like those dreams were within reach again. I wasn't naive enough to think Claire and Mike would ever admit they were wrong. People like them never do. But that wasn't the point. The point was that I'd taken back control of my life, and no amount of denial on their part could change that. As the days passed, I wondered if they'd try to contact me. A part of me even expected an angry phone call or a barrage of texts. But the silence was deafening. Maybe they realized there was no point in trying to guilt me anymore. Or maybe they were too busy dealing with the fallout of the letter. Either way, I didn't care, because for the first time, I was free. By the time Claire and Mike landed back in the States, I was already 2 weeks into my new life. I got a job at a local diner, a small but steady start. The hours were long, the pay wasn't great, but every dollar I earned felt like freedom. I wasn't looking over my shoulder anymore. I wasn't worried about Claire's next guilt trip or Mike's passive-aggressive comments. My life was mine now, and every decision I made, no matter how small, reminded me of how far I'd come. But even as I moved forward, I couldn't help but wonder how things were unraveling for them. The first sign of trouble probably hit them as soon as they walked through the door. The house wasn't in the pristine condition Claire expected. Sure, I hadn't trashed the place, but I hadn't bothered to keep up with her impossible standards either. Dishes were left unwashed, the kids' toys were scattered across the living room, and the list of chores she'd handed me remained untouched on the kitchen counter. It wasn't enough to cause real damage, just enough to make a point. And then there was the mail. Among the usual bills and junk mail was an envelope addressed to Claire and Mike from my dad's old lawyer. I knew what was inside. Copies of the same financial documents I'd included in my letter, along with a formal notice that the misuse of my college fund was under review. I imagined Claire tearing it open, her hands shaking as she scanned the contents. For all her bravado, she wasn't stupid. She'd know exactly what this meant. You think she's serious? Mike might have asked, hovering behind her. Of course she's serious. Claire would have snapped, her voice laced with panic. Why else would she send this? They'd spent years controlling me, but now the tables had turned. The trust fund wasn't just a moral issue. It was a legal one, and they were finally starting to feel the weight of what they'd done. Meanwhile, I was building something they'd never be able to touch. Katie had connected me with a local community college where I was able to enroll in night classes. It wasn't the university experience I dreamed of, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. One night, as I sat in my tiny apartment, flipping through a textbook, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I knew immediately who it was. "Jenny, it's Claire," the voice said, sharp and clipped. I stayed silent, letting her squirm in the silence. "Listen," she continued, her tone shifting to something resembling faux concern. "We need to talk. This whole thing has gotten out of hand. Let's be reasonable, okay?" I almost laughed. Reasonable? Coming from the woman who'd stolen my future and called it a favor? "Jenny, you can't just cut us off like this," she pressed. "We're family." That word hit me like a slap. For years, she'd weaponized it to keep me in line, to make me believe that her exploitation was love. But now it was just a hollow excuse. "I think we're done here," I said calmly, my voice steady. Before she could respond, I hung up. The silence that followed was deafening, but it wasn't the kind of silence that made me uneasy. It was peaceful, almost liberating. For the first time, I felt like I had the final word. Over the next few months, I started to rebuild. The job at the diner wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me a sense of independence I hadn't felt in years. My classes were challenging, but I loved every second of them. I'd also started making new friends, people who saw me for who I was, not who they could use me to be. Slowly but surely, I was carving out a life that was mine and mine alone. And Claire and Mike? I heard through the grapevine that things weren't going well. Word about the college fund scandal had started to spread, and their once perfect reputation was beginning to crack. The lawyer had followed up with more inquiries, and while I didn't know all the details, I had a feeling they were in for a rough time. For a long time, I'd wondered if they'd ever feel the weight of what they'd done to me. Now, I didn't have to wonder anymore. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in the park with Katie, watching kids run around and chase each other. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked, her voice soft. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not the way I used to." She raised an eyebrow, curious. For years, I let them live rent-free in my head. I spent so much time worrying about what they wanted, what they thought, what they'd do next. But now, I paused, letting the warmth of the sun wash over me. Now they're just a chapter in my story, and I'm finally writing the next one. As I walked back to my apartment that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was mine to travel. And no matter how much Claire and Mike tried to hold on to their version of the story, I knew the truth. I was free.